What can we learn from some of the world's most notorious cyber attacks? I'm Tonya Hall for ZDNet and Tech Republic, and joining me is Charles Arthur. He is the author of the book, Cyber Wars, Hacks That Shocked the Business World. Welcome, Charles. So before we get into your book, give us a brief summary of your resume.
I worked at The Guardian as the technology editor, editing a weekly printed supplement, which then went away because the internet came along in a big way for about 10 years. Previous to that, I was at a newspaper called The Independent, which was also a daily newspaper. Before that, I was at a science magazine, New Scientist. Before that, I was a business magazine called Business. Before that, I was at a weekly computer magazine called Computer Weekly. I go with the nomenclature.
What motivated you to write Cyber Wars?
It was actually the publisher got in touch with me and said, we think there's something really interesting to be done about hacking and about the sort of lessons that can be learned for businesses out of the amount of hacking that's going on. Could you sort of put together something along these lines? And I was able to come up with a list of important hacks, big hacks, within the course of an evening, literally. It was really that easy to think of, important hacks. But as I worked on the book, as I sort of looked at the examples and sort of worked through and spoke to people, spoke to the businesses that had been affected, spoke to the hackers who had been carrying them out, it became clear that there are all sorts of subtle things about why hacks happen, about the ways businesses react to them, about the things that people do, which I think more people needed to know about.
When you think of robots, autonomous vehicles, IoT, computer vision, mobile devices, the cloud, you realize that everything is connected. And one of the chapters in your book is the Internet of the Hacked Things. What are the weak links that hackers like best to exploit?
The real weak links are defaults. It's systems which are set up so that there's always an easy way to get into them. So that will be things which are going to be administered remotely. So typically the Internet of Things, something which is in a remote place. It doesn't have a screen, it doesn't have a keyboard. It's connected to the internet, but you need some way to monitor what's going on. And typically those sorts of systems will have a default admin login, where the username will be admin, the password will be password, or it might be admin. And if you can find that, it's often hard-coded in, then you can take it over and you can hack it to your heart's content. And that's the sort of thing that happened, for example, with the Mirai botnet, which was actually tens of thousands of VCRs, internet-connected VCRs, internet-connected fridges, internet-connected heaters, all those sorts of things which had been taken over using a 20-year-old flaw in a piece of shell code, and were made to do, to carry out bot attacks, to carry out DDoS attacks against, big companies.
When it comes to IoT, what questions should you ask? What should you look for to know you're getting a more secure device?
It's very difficult with IoT because a lot of the things around the business models of Internet of Things devices don't actually work in your favor. If you want to be secure, they're not in your favor. If you're a hacker, they're great. But often there's a question about, well, who's going to update the software? Because there's always going to be a need for software. Is it going to be the maker of the device? Is it going to be the person who sold the device? Is it going to be you, the user? Who's going to be doing the updating of the software if it happens? Is it going to be someone with a remote login? In which case, how do they know what the login is? Is it going to be the user? In which case, you have to look after those credentials carefully. The key questions are, who's actually responsible for it? And in a lot of cases with the Internet of Things devices, companies and people buy for the price. They don't buy for the future. So they get something that's cheap. But cheap often means you don't get the support. And as the examples show again and again, if you don't have the support, then eventually you will get hacked.
Is the business community keeping up with security, or should this be something that is regulated by government?
That's a really gigantic question. I mean, the business community, I think, tries to do as much as it can about this. And, obviously many companies try to stay on top of things, but as organizations grow, as they become more sprawling, it's really difficult to maintain security. And it's only if keeping data secure is actually the number one thing you have to do that you are able to keep your focus on doing it. I mean, I'd say the best example here of a company which has grown and grown and yet been able to keep security at its heart is Google. Because if someone is able to break into Google, then that's really game over. And it's telling that even they haven't been able to do that. So there was the announcement just the other week that they're going to shut down Google Plus because they discovered that the Google Plus API had all sorts of holes in it, which could allow someone suitably smart to build an app which would access the API, which would be able to get all sorts of personal data. So if even Google can't do this, then what sort of hope for the average company? But then if you talk about government regulation, the trouble is that government regulations tend to be really blunt instruments. They're very slow to come into play. They tend not to be as effective as a suitably motivated company. But at the same time, I think there is a role for government regulation, just in the sense of telling businesses what will happen if they get it wrong. So if you're told you'll face a big fine if you're hacked, that tends to focus companies' attention. And that's certainly the case in the UK and the rest of Europe, where we have the GDPR, which has very substantial fines if personal data is lost. I think the fact that the US is seeing California following on along these lines is indicative that people are starting to realize that data really has value, and that looking after it isn't just a sort of something to be done afterwards.
You talk about ransomware in the book, and we think of this as a relatively recent bit of cyber mischief, but you document an early ransomware attack as far back as the 1980s. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there was a particularly, shall we say, unique guy who was a sort of a medical researcher who got very obsessed with AIDS, and around the time of one of the first AIDS conferences, distributed a whole lot of floppies, because floppy drives were how you distributed stuff in those days. But these had a very early form of ransomware on. This is 1983. When PCs were really very, very new things. But they had ransomware on it, which would encrypt the drive, or encrypt the system, so that people couldn't get at them. Trouble was that this was before the internet. This was before people really had a handle on using public key encryption. So actually, it was quite easy to decrypt them, because the key for doing the encryption was actually on the drive already. But that didn't prevent a few people sort of losing their data because they screwed things up when they did it. So that was a very early example. But that example got some other academics sort of 12 years later thinking about this, and they then came up with the idea of, well, what if you use public key encryption so that you have the key for the ransomware, the decryption key, stored somewhere away from the computer? It's like the inverse of hacking, I think, ransomware. It's a really strange reversal, because rather than the normal sort of hacking where people take your data and they make it publicly available, which so WikiLeaks is a sort of example, ransomware takes your data and makes it unavailable to you, who's really the only person who generally wants to see it. And I think it's really interesting how ransomware is an effective form of commercial hacking, which doesn't actually make any data available.
Okay, Charles, we've been talking about two-factor identification now for years. Why don't more people use it?
I think the problem is that people think it's going to really screw them up. They think of the worst case scenarios. They think, okay, so I have two-factor authentication turned on, and I'm waiting for the text message so I can log into Facebook or whatever. But what if someone steals my phone? What if my phone breaks? How am I going to get in then? And they worry about that rather than worrying about, well, what if someone gets my password and is able to break into my system? And what if they get into my Amazon account and use it to buy themselves tokens, give themselves lots of money, which is typically how people steal money from you on Amazon. The reality is two-factor authentication these days is really easy to set up, really easy to implement, and you can use an app such as Authy, A-U-T-H-Y, which will sync across your devices, so you're not tied just to one phone, which you might lose. It also doesn't use SMS, so those can't be intercepted, which is the other risk that you have with two-factor authentication. I think, though, that not enough people have heard of it. Not enough of the companies which implement it push it on people. So, you can have it for Amazon, you can have it for Twitter, you can have it for Dropbox, you can have it on Google, obviously, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, pretty much any of these ones, you name it. Spotify is the big exception. They don't have it, which is not a good thing. But companies like Apple, for example, push you to put on your two-factor authentication. They actually show this little red blob in your settings file, encouraging you to do it. And yet 95% of people don't have their two-factor authentication turned on for their email, which is far too many, I think.
You wrote about TJX, otherwise known as TJ Maxx. I love them. And I think at the time they were trying to be really forward thinking. What went wrong?
They were trying to be forward thinking. What they realized was that Wi-Fi, which was then very new, this is sort of back in 2001, Wi-Fi would mean they wouldn't actually have to string cables between their point of sales outlets and the central system. They could just have the point of sale outlet, a little Wi-Fi device, and a Wi-Fi system, and in the ceiling or whatever, and they'd be able to send their transactions to it and get it to the central computers. TJX relies on selling clothes and so on at low prices, so they're into high turnover, high inventory turn. But the problem was, what they didn't know was that wired equivalent privacy, which was the security system then in use for Wi-Fi when it was first introduced, was fatally flawed. It could be cracked within an hour if you used the right program. And it didn't matter how long your passcode was for it. It didn't matter how long you made it. You would still be cracked within an hour, simply because of the fact of how you reused the passkey. And this had been known before it was made a standard. I spoke to one of the authors of a letter who wrote to the Wi-Fi Standards Committee and said, "Look, guys, this can be broken within an hour by anyone using a program like this." And yet they ignored him. They just went straight on and continued and implemented it, which meant that TJX then had a system which was wide open to anyone to hack into if they wanted to and if they knew about it. And sure enough, a gang came along, figured it out, broke into the system, planted a Trojan inside the system, siphoned loads of credit card details off, cost them about $250 million.
Wow. Now, at the end of many of the chapters, you summarize the lessons learned from hacks documented in the book. And looking over them, what lessons should we learn from the summary of the summaries?
Well, for a business, I guess it would be make all your staff use two-factor authentication. Make them use work emails rather than personal emails for work. Make sure that you stay on the leading edge, but not the bleeding edge. Make sure things are up to date. Occasionally try to get people to break into your systems. See if you can phish the senior members of the board, because they're often the ones who have the worst security knowledge, and yet they have the most power in terms of what can be done in the company. When it comes to individuals, go for the two-factor authentication. Be wary of giving personal details to companies that you don't really know about, or which are startups, because the rule generally is that companies will get hacked. You're not completely sure when, but in some time they will get hacked. I mean, we've had an example just recently. There was this company which set up an app called Donald's Dates, which is, are you a Trump supporter and you want to find a date? And people just keep saying, "Ooh, you're a Trump supporter." It's like Tinder for Trumpists, I guess. And within the first day that this thing was released, a security researcher realized that you could actually download the entire database because they'd had a completely fatal flaw. They hadn't tested it against anyone who was maliciously looking to break into it. They just thought people would be nice. The lesson is, people are not going to be nice to your system. They're not going to be nice to your data. So don't trust companies with data if they don't have to. Give a fake birthday. Give it the 1st of January 1970, which is the unique epochs. It'll make you seem younger perhaps, or older, but you'll certainly be able to buy alcohol. You might qualify for discounts at some point, and it'll be easy to remember. Doesn't matter that it's not your real birthday, because you can remember it.
Good advice, Charles. Charles Arthur, author of the book Cyber Wars: Hacks That Shocked the Business World, and former technology editor at The Guardian. If somebody wants to connect with you, Charles, maybe they want to get a copy of your book, which I certainly highly recommend, or maybe they want to just connect with you personally. How can they do that?
So on Twitter, I'm Charles Arthur, spelled as with my name, and you can buy the book. You can order it. It's on Amazon. You can also buy it directly, and you get a slight discount from Kogan Page, who are the publishers. That's Kogan with a K, OGANPAGE.com.
Thanks again. And if you guys want to connect with me or find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or go to my website, tonyahall.net. I've got links to all my social sites. Thanks for watching.